Tony Hay, Chief Data Scientist of the Science and Technology Facilities Council, UK. The fourth paradigm, data-intensive scientific discovery.
Hi, well, it's great to be here back in Berlin and celebrating this wonderful event about Konrad Zuse and Leibniz. So I'm going to talk about the revolution that Ed referred to, which is the revolution of big data in science and in business. And it's really transforming the way the world works in a very profound way. So, fourth paradigm, what is it? Well, much of science now is becoming data intensive. We have satellite surveys, we have high throughput gene sequencing, as we heard, $100 will do our own genome, and routinely in hospitals you'll have your genome sequenced when you go in. And so it's not just the volume of data, because the particle physicists and the astronomers have petabytes of data, but there is also this intermediate data, like the gene sequencing, like the array expression. What does the protein, does the gene express, the protein structures, the pathways, very complex data which you have to put together. And I'll talk about one example about velocity. This is data from sensors streaming in 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. How do you make sense of that? How do you see things that are significant happening? Smart cities are an example of that. And the last V, I would claim, in the 4 Vs of data, is actually knowing what's been done with the data. So who took it, what they did to it before you got it. And you need to know the provenance of the data, and you need to give credit to the people who took the data. So those are the 4 Vs of big data, and they're becoming apparent in almost every field of science. Big data is becoming important. This is my ex-colleague at Microsoft Research, Jim Gray, and Jim was a database specialist. He's one of the people who invented transaction processing. When you put your money, get your money out of an ATM, use technology invented by Jim. And he realized very early on, in the around the 2000, that the biggest data sets were not in the banks at the time, but were actually in science. And so he chose to work with astronomers. And he liked astronomy particularly because the astronomical data, as he said, had absolutely no commercial value. You could do what you liked with it. And so he actually worked with this Sloan Digital Sky Survey, and with Alex Zale, an astronomer at Johns Hopkins, and a couple of graduate students, they put up the first web service which allowed this data to be seen by everybody. And it could be seen, large amounts of data on the images and the spectra, and it had 2 million astronomical objects, 800,000 galaxies, 100,000 quasars. And of course, there's not enough astronomers in the world to actually go and look at each of these individually. And so that lay the possibility of allowing citizen science. And the public were very interested in looking at this data. It's very beautiful images of the sky, and it's had many, many individual citizens looking at the data, and has generated real science, but also has allowed the possibility of citizen science. And you saw an example of the supernova discovery in the previous one. Similar discoveries have been made by citizens looking at this Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So this was really a transformative, I called it the cosmic genome, because it really was indicative of the way big data is coming to astronomy and other fields coming along. So Jim Gray used this as an example, and he believed you could now see that besides computational science, computational biology, computational chemistry, and so on, you were seeing another part of the science where you looked at all the data issues. That's bioinformatics, chemoinformatics, in the previous case, astroinformatics, and so on. So the informatics side, and there you needed students who knew not only programming computers and theory and so on, but you needed people who could manage large data sets, who could visualize them, who could analyze them, and actually share them and so on, reorganize them. So these sort of skills were becoming needed, he believed. And he believed that the computer science community actually could help you with that, because you needed data mining algorithms and machine learning comes in here, databases, and you needed visualization for all this data. So computer science could actually help these new disciplines of each of the scientific domains. And so what Jim talked about was what he called the fourth paradigm. So what does I mean by that? Well, we've been doing experimental science for 1,000 years or more with the Egyptians and so on, and observing the sky. And in the last few hundred years, since people like Galileo, Newton, Maxwell, Schrödinger, and so on, we have now equations of theoretical physics which summarize that experimental data, and you can now analyze those mathematically and make predictions. And you can make predictions which you can then verify. And those were the two paradigms, the two ways we've done science by using theory and experiment. But as we heard, in the middle of the last century, in the 1940s and 50s, Konrad Zuse and others invented the digital computer. And Ken Wilson, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1970s, called computational science the third paradigm, because you could do things like collision of black holes, you can do things like galaxy formation, you can do experiments on climate change, where the equations are too complicated to solve analytically with mathematics, but you can solve them on a computer, and you can do computer experiments, changing parameters. So it's a new way of exploring science. And to do that, you need to train students who know about algorithms, numerical methods, parallel computers, and parallel programming. So I've just written a book about computing, and I was a little worried that I hadn't mentioned Leibniz and Zuse, but I'm very pleased to see, having just checked, that I mentioned Leibniz as inventing binary numbers, and Konrad Zuse not only for the Z3, but also he invented the first programming language, Planck-Calcul. So I'm pleased that I got the history right in there. But computational science came along in the 1950s, but now we are seeing almost every field of science being overwhelmed by large amounts of data, from instruments, from simulations on supercomputers, by sensor networks, and so on. And I used to work on what I called eScience, or ED on cyber infrastructure, which is a set of tools and technologies for managing this data-intensive explosion. So Jim Gray called this the fourth paradigm, data-intensive science. What are you going to do with all this data? How are you going to analyze it? How are you going to find significant signals? You need to train new sets of scientists with new skills in order to do that. So let me just give you 3 quick examples. One example is from when I was working with Microsoft Research with a group of machine learning experts who were turning their talents to genomics. And here the idea is that you'll have personalized medicine, you'll find all your genome sequences, and you'll find these SNPs, these single nucleotide polymorphisms, these gene defects, which are different for you than for me, and you'll be able to say that I should get this drug and you should get that drug. That's the idea. So what they did was look at the Wellcome Trust data for gene sequenced a large number of people for 7 different diseases, and controls didn't have those diseases. And instead of looking at single SNPs, they looked at pairs of SNPs, and there's about 60 billion in the data. And if you did it on a single computer, it would take you many, many years to do it. But by using 27,000 cores in the cloud, you were able to do that in 13 days. And they discovered a correlation. If you had this defect and this defect, then you were more prone to get a particular form of coronary artery disease. So that's an example of big data, but also big computing that is needed to do it, and sophisticated machine learning type algorithms in order to analyze that data. The next one is a project from the NSF. It's the Ocean Observatory Institute, which is in many aspects, but one of the aspects is off where I live in Seattle. My house in Seattle is right next. There's a volcano to the left and a volcano to the right, and it's on an earthquake fault, which is slightly disturbing. It's on the Ring of Fire, and they get an earthquake of category 9 about every 200 years or so. The last one occurred about 200 years ago, all right? So what they're doing is putting a cable on the Juan de Fuca plate under the sea, and you'll, for the first time, be able to see what's going on the seabed, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So instead of a professor with his grad students taking a ship and going along the surface taking data and then taking the data home on a USB stick, it's too big to do that, and you get the data coming in 24 hours a day, and you need tools to analyze that, and it's going to transform our knowledge of what goes on under the sea. Here you see, this is a little mini volcano on the fault lines. It's called a seamount, and all sorts of life forms in this very non-oxygen environment actually take place there. We know very little about the whole of the ecosystem that takes place under the sea, and it's one of the most important ecosystems for the way we live, the environment, for global warming, and so on. So it's going to transform ocean science. Another example is where I now work. I now work at the Rutherford Lab near Oxford, and so over here is my building, and there's also here a Centre for Environmental Data Analysis, which collects all the climate data and all the sort of ocean data, weather data and stuff like that, and it puts it in a new type of computer. So this is a computer that has been built from scratch with compute, so it does many very powerful high-performance computing right next, very closely coupled to petabytes of data. And so you have a computer which can do compute with data very closely by, and also you can do cloud computing on this type of architecture. So it's a very exciting type of architecture for the environmental scientists to actually go and study and examine their data. So those are just 3 examples. But I would like to talk a little bit about another thing that started essentially in Berlin, which is the open access movement. The open access was a word actually that was coined in 2001 in Budapest, the Budapest Open Access meeting hosted by George Soros's Open Society Institute. And it was the idea that if our taxes have paid for the research to be done and the papers to be published, we should be able to see it. And we should be able, as the general public, should be able to access that without having to pay again as a toll to see it. And this was picked up again in a leadership role by the Berlin Declaration in 2003, where the German funding agencies with some others got together and really promoted the idea, first of all, that the internet was a critical thing to distribute global scientific knowledge, and that it should also be available to the public. And in addition to the papers, that you write the papers, you need to know the data on which the results have been designed. And so they talked about making also the original scientific research results available. And that's the basis for the open science revolution that we are having today. In February 2013, in the USA, a very important memo was issued by the White House. It was on requiring all the federal agencies like NSF, like Department of Energy, like DARPA and so on, to make the results of the publicly funded research available to the public. And so they had to have a plan to increase public access to the results of research. And again, it was not just the research paper, the actual written paper, but it was also to the data on which that paper is based on. So they again defined research results, the digital recorded factual material commonly accepted as necessary to validate the research findings. So this has really changed things. It's epitomized by one of the pioneers of this activity, which again Jim Gray worked with the National Library of Medicine. They were one of the pioneers. If you had a grant from the National Institutes of Medicine in the USA, they asked you to put your paper in a database called PubMed Central. And when it was voluntary, they had about 20% of people bothered to do it. When it was signed into law by George Bush, it went up to 70% of the people did it. And in 2013, the National Institutes of Health said, we will delay your next research grant unless you put your papers there. And as you can imagine, it's been going up 0.5% a month ever since, and is well over nearing 90%. But the reason I show this is because this is, admittedly, the National Library of Medicine get several $100 million a year to run the National Library of Medicine, but it's an example of what they can do. So you can go from the paper in PubMed Central to the data sets on which those are based, and you can research by looking at the different data sets using a tool called Entree. And you can make discoveries just by actually analyzing the data, adding your own data to it. And it's indicative of what we could really accelerate the way science goes on if we could make this available in every field, that you have the publications and the data on which the papers are based. And that's really a vision that we should all aspire to. So, what of the future? Well, I think there are some challenges for universities and for funding agencies. So, one of the challenges is, what's a data scientist? It's now, my title is Chief Data Scientist. Data science covers many things. And I've just highlighted 3 particular aspects which you could call data science. One, if you like, is the data engineer. That's the person who takes the data from the satellite, puts the images all together, and gives the data set to the scientist to analyze, or takes the data coming in from the sensors under the ocean, puts them into scientific data sets, again, that the environmental scientists can then go and analyze. So it's actually understanding how the data is acquired, what the processing is done on it, putting it together to make a data set on which you can do data analytics. And so the second role would be of a data analyst who knows all these clever algorithms, advanced statistics, machine learning, and so on, deep neural networks, all these techniques from computer science on big commercial data can be applied on scientific data. And you see now books on machine learning in astronomy, machine learning in environmental science. These methods are becoming ubiquitous and necessary for scientists to get science out of their big data sets. And the last aspect I'd pick up is this one, a data steward. You've spent a lot of money getting this data. You'd like to be able to use some of it later on. And so you need to have metadata, which tells that's data about the data. So when someone picks it up, they know what the data is about and what's been done to it. And that requires expert curation. And you can't keep all of this data. You need to decide which data is really worth keeping. Measurements, for example, of the temperature of the North Sea for the last 30 years, you cannot repeat. If it's a computer simulation, yes, you can do that. So you may not need to keep all that. So these are the challenges of a data scientist. But there's also another challenge, which I'll just finish on, which are career paths for scientists. So in the past, we have, at the top, you have the professor, Herr Professor. Right? And then you have the postdocs, who work for him, and then the graduate students, who do all the work. All right? Shoulders of giants, as Newton said. But actually, we see now the emergence of another tier, which is equally or more important. You need people who understand about writing scientific software. It can't be done by a traditional software engineer. It needs to have someone who understands the science to get the software right, but can also write good software that people can use and build on. So scientific software engineers are a critical part. And increasingly, you'll also see data scientists. So you have software engineers and data scientists applied to science. Those are going to be critical. What is their career path? They're never going to be Herr Professor, but how can they get a career which keeps them doing useful things in the scientific domain? Of course, if you're a data scientist, you can go and treble your salary working for business. So maybe it's not so bad. And so the final thing I'd like to conclude is Jim Gray's vision. And it was based on his work with National Library of Medicine, where he helped them develop a portable version of PubMed Central, which you'll be pleased to know is now available as PubMed Central Europe, which is run by the European Bioinformatics Institute near Cambridge. They host all the papers published in bioinformatics and medical informatics, are all held in this database, and then you can link also to other data like the protein data bank and so on. And this is the vision of Jim, that you go from the literature you have your data on which you can add your data, you can add new services and so on. And this is the way we can speed up, increase scientific information velocity, increase scientific productivity. And this is the vision, I think, for big data in science that we should aspire to. And that gives me 3 seconds. Thank you very much.